are done better, and we would tentatively say at lower cost than maybe more formal state-sponsored measures. We didn't do cost-benefit analysis on the equator price case studies, but there's enough anecdotal evidence to support that. I pick out protected area management. If recent studies have shown that mixed protected area management, and especially ICCAs, can be more effective than strict protected area management. If studies have made the quantitative argument for that, equator price winners really make the qualitative argument. Lesson number 5 is that community-based action delivers across the whole suite of the Millennium Development Goals, and this is something that I'm sure won't be news to many people here. Essentially what we see is that there's mainstreaming in communication channels, so mainstreaming messages on gender and health sort of within communication on conservation. And there's a lesson here for the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, which is that putting local groups at the forefront of these efforts is the way to get it done. Lesson number 6 is there's strength in the fusion of the modern and traditional. I hope that makes sense. Essentially, it's a two-part message. One is that traditional approaches, indigenous knowledge, have their place in modern development interventions, but that also that modern technologies and processes can be readily adapted to local settings. And we see this in many different ways: the reintroduction of traditional resource management systems, value-added processing, seed banks, new markets for medicinal plants. Lesson 7 is that communication is a powerful agent of behavior change. Not just that, but that above almost this more than anything else is what equator price winners do so well. The variety of means through which they communicate targeted messages to large, spread out audiences. And I pick out maybe just 3: the use of culturally appropriate communication strategies, the use of knowledge networks, and innovative uses of technology like participatory 3D modeling, mapping, and farm radio. There are many equator prize winners that demonstrate really innovative ways of communicating these messages. Then on tenure security, land tenure security, property rights are essential. I think people would agree with that. Again, it's really the variety of means through which groups have been able to improve their land tenure situations. Working with local governments is a particularly effective means of doing this. Number 9 is that local good governance exists, and we put this in really as answering a call from donors for accountability and transparency in the way the funds are used on the ground. There's a weight of evidence to back this up, and again, I'd probably single out the inclusion of marginalized or underrepresented sectors of society as being a key aspect of this. Lesson 10 is that scaling of success is possible and can bring landscape level change. Maybe the best example of this is the Fiji locally managed marine area network, which in 2002 was a winner of the first equator prize, with only a few LMA sites at the time. The graph shows the growth of it's actually the wider LMA network since then, which is quite incredible. And we identified 4 different kinds of scaling: quantitative, functional, organizational, and political. And if you want to know more about those, you should read the book. Lesson 11 is that partnerships matter. In many different ways, partnerships are absolutely vital to the work of local groups, of course. It's particularly relevant to the Equator Initiative, given that we function as a partnership. I put different ways in which that's the case, but again, I'd single out the partnerships that don't necessarily diminish autonomy. There are lots of successful examples of groups that sort of graduate from partner support. Small investments can be targeted, small investments can bring huge results, and this really backs up the work of the UNDP JET Small Grants Program. And finally, again, the partnerships with local government can be particularly effective, often as backstops to sort of traditional resource management systems. The final lesson is that local innovation breeds adaptation and resilience. Resilience is a result of social, economic, and environmental processes. It's about more than just adaptation and climate change. It's built on innovation and adaptation. It's about solving local problems with local solutions, with local resources, providing you perspectives on chronic issues, the ability to endure through failures and setbacks. We see that success is not a straight road, it's often a process of trial and error. And the result, what you end up with, is embedded resilience that we think is rooted in local capacity. So to conclude, I have a couple of USB drives with me that have this publication on. They also have a second publication by the Small Grants Program on 20 years of the Small Grants Program. So please see me again if you'd like a copy. Thanks very much.
So I'm giving this talk on behalf of the PEN team, the Poverty and Environment Network team of C4, which is a team of up to 50 external and internal people, mostly comprised of PhD students, but 10 to 12 senior resource people as well. So I am one of those members of the team, so any shortfalls in this presentation, please refer to my other members and colleagues of that team. So essentially I'm going to give a very brief outline to what PEN is, what the Poverty and Environment Network is, and provide some quick and dirty research findings. We're in the final process of analysing our huge data set for publication in the next few months. And I'd like to present some preliminary findings. So PEN is essentially a very large, tropical-wide collection of detailed and high quality, we think high quality, comparable data, which is essentially collected by PhD students. And essentially looking at the poverty and environment nexus, looking at how important forest products are for rural livelihoods. And we believe that it's currently the most comprehensive analysis of the poverty and forest linkages undertaken to date. Essentially, it's an approach that incorporates PhD students. PhD students tend to have a relative amount of enthusiasm and hope. They're engaged in long periods of field work, and as I said, they're supported from C4 by a network of senior resource persons. There are mutual benefits to this arrangement. PhD students are able to tap into the expertise of C4 staff and also their university supervisors, but also we are able to generate huge amounts of data. Capacity building, the majority of our partners are from developing countries, and a book that was published last year by EarthScan really highlighted how much we've thought about the methodology related to PEN, and we like to think that it's somewhat of a state-of-the-art, a textbook model, if you like, for how to collect livelihood data in rural settings. So PEN, the numbers, we have 25 countries which are represented by PEN. There are 40 studies, although only 38 were good enough finally for the data set to be finalised. You can see that there's over 200 households in the average study, but I'll go down further and further and further. 17 million data sets, which for our poor database manager is somewhat daunting. And one of the major problems we've had is cleaning the data and making sure that the data that we have is credible and replicable. And it's been considerably challenging. Just a quick map to show exactly where we have been undertaking our studies. There's quite a nice representative sample across all 3 continents. And essentially, the 2 hypotheses that PEN was set out to test was to look at what the significance of forest environmental income is for rural livelihoods, and to understand whether it is or not that the poor who rely on forests. And obviously many of us are aware that the open, easy access issues related to poverty and forest access are extremely important, but also the issues of lack of opportunities, and I'll touch on those in subsequent slides. So some results. I was really delighted to see how much in Chris's presentation the figures are resonating with the LLS studies. If I can see it. So this is our global data set with all of our households included. So our contribution of forest income is just over 20%, so about 1/5, if you like, of all household income for all of the households that we sampled. There's a smaller amount of other environmental income, and this includes income such as minerals and fodder for livestock, but we haven't included those in the global data set as yet. Looking at whether the poor or the richer members of the community are more reliant on forest products, the quintiles here represent the top 20%. These are the richest members of particular communities, and at the bottom we have the poorest. And as you can see, forest reliance is very much more predominated by the rural poor. There's some interesting intersite variation, particularly across continental levels. There's a nice grouping of the African sites here, which are very reliant on forest products, but do not receive so much income, if you like, from those particular forest products. Asia, again, a nice, heavily strong reliance on forest products, but again, limited value in terms of the actual overall income generation. But here's some interesting outliers from Latin America, and although overall forest reliance is relatively low, there are significant income generation activities, for example, Brazil nut in Peru, Bolivia, and elsewhere in Latin America. So there are some nice regional differences which the data have picked up. So we've also disaggregated much of the data set to look at various aspects of other forms of poverty and environmental linkages, and particularly gender. This is a study that I led with a team looking at essentially what is the gender differentiation in our data set. And unfortunately, many of the claims made in the literature are very much focused on case studies, and we weren't quite sure how replicable or they can be upscaled into policy recommendations. And so we essentially took our entire data set and looked at the gender differentiation of the forestry and poverty linkages. And just as one example, the general conception is that women collect forest products, or predominate in terms of the forest product collection. And in fact, globally, that's a fairly accurate assessment. W here obviously stands for women, B is both, so the shared activities, and men here. In Latin America, actually, it's quite the opposite. Men dominate the harvest, the sale rather, of subsistence, collection and sale of forest products. In Asia, it's pretty much equitable, but in Africa, women do dominate, as Chris mentioned in his presentation, women do dominate the forest product collection process in Africa. And just to highlight, there is a large regional variation in both the shares of forest products collected by women. But one point I really want to make here is that disaggregating our data set, we've come to question some of the sort of perceived wisdoms, if you like, about the role of both genders, of men and women, in the collection of forest products. And men, excuse me, do play a much more significant role in the contribution of forest products to rural livelihoods. What happens with that household income is subject to debate. We don't have consumption data, and there's some speculation as to how much that male income contributes to the household income or household economy, but that's something that we want to, the fact that most of the men in the audience are smiling on. But it's something we want to test in future research. We also looked at tenure. I've just got the 3-minute warning, so I think I'm going to try and skip through this as much as possible. But basically, in terms of regional forest tenure, there are major differences between Africa and the two other continents in terms of community forests and private land. And these correlate relatively well with the RRI, who owns the world's forests study as well. There are some major findings related to that, and Pam Jagger and her team are going to be writing this up, or have written this up, and it's published in World Development in the last month or so. I'm not going to go through these in particular, but they're pretty obvious from the bullet points. And one of the final studies was looking at how rural households contribute towards deforestation, and what are the drivers of deforestation. And primarily, agricultural production is the most important, and as you can see, the others are of less significance. Interestingly, only 27% of households, as part of our global survey, actually do clear land. And obviously this may be highly variable across sites, and it's even more interesting is that the area of land cleared is actually very small. And this is primarily due to most households focusing on swim agriculture. Very few of the households that we were involved in the survey were involved at all in any commercial agricultural activities. Land clearing is much more prevalent amongst land-rich households for obvious reasons. Clearing significantly more land than the land is poor, again for obvious reasons. Male-headed households clear more land, younger households, and households close to forest. And interestingly, households that have suffered shocks, whether it be climatic shocks, inter-household shocks such as death in the family, or the need to generate immediate income. So our final conclusions, we concur with the evidence study that around 1/5 of household income is generated from forests, and that the poor do seem to be more reliant on these forest products. But failing the policy implications, if you like, by failing to account for this contribution, does give a rather misleading picture of rural livelihoods and overestimates the instance of poverty in many respects. Aaron Levinson, who's leading the paper on this particular issue, which will be published in World Development as part of a special issue I'll mention here in a second, really does go into the policy implications of these particular findings. I mentioned the gender issue. Our paper really does question some of the perceived wisdom related to the role of men and women in the rural economy with regard to forest products. And we also need to think about the possible biases and perspectives on the pathways in and out of rural poverty, particularly the benefits of converting forest to cropland and the overestimation and economically that may represent. I think both previous speakers have mentioned the importance of tenure and property rights, absolutely crucial for investment for rural urbaners, and issues of access, particularly exclusion from protected areas that we found in most of our sites was a major problem. There's going to be a special issue of World Development published in the next, hopefully, 2 to 3 months, which will contain all of the data and research that I presented here. The C4 Pen website contains much of the preliminary data set and some of the data itself, so you can actually have access to some of the data sets and other data that I presented here. Thank you very much.
We do have one more presentation. For that, because I will have to leave at some point for the other meeting, I thought I would just share 3 or 4 minutes worth of insights that I've acquired over the last 30 years of trying to create livelihoods in situations where the resource base has been either fully degraded or destroyed. I work in the central part of India, a region called Bundelkhand, which is about certainly one of the 2 poorest parts of India. It's heavily populated. There's 1 head of cattle for every human being. It's really a tough situation where they virtually destroyed the countryside. It used to be 60, 80 years ago heavily forested with teak and bamboo and other thick forests, and now it's almost a desert. We worked there, we worked in many other parts of India, but I just give you a word picture because I didn't bring my slides with me, to really say that it's possible to do very dramatic things. I think going for 10% or incremental change in the lives of the poor is really, in my opinion, not acceptable anymore. The time is gone for us to be able to say, we'll get you out of poverty in 20 years' time. It's just not real in a world which has a $60 trillion economy. So my own organization took a slightly different route. We're driven by the exact same motives, same goals, to really eradicate poverty, not simply reducing it. And to do so in a manner that also regenerates the resource base, the soils, the waters, the forests, the hills. And we've done so with basically an approach that involved heavy emphasis on technological innovation, designing technologies that would end up by being more efficient, therefore reducing the pressure on resources. For example, cook stoves, varieties of combustion technologies. One of the technologies that we have most successfully used for this purpose is low-cost building materials, which use no baking of bricks and no external energy, rather use human energy, compressing mud into extremely good building materials. So we did, right from the beginning in our organization, develop a whole ranges of technologies for providing people with the things they need at a resource cost that was much lower than the way that it was. And that has been quite successful. We've, in 30 years, we've probably created more than 3 million livelihoods, jobs up there in the field. They're not on our payroll, but we created the means by which those jobs were created. We ran for 7 years, 6.5, 7 years, a small grants program for DFID, for the UK government's aid agency, government agency, which was about $50 million over that period, about 10 to $12 million a year, in which, according to their independent evaluation, we had impacted, they said, powered the lives of 6.6 million households. Now, you know, that's possible to do if your business model is thinking that you don't try to do it yourself. You try to build up the capacity of local NGOs in many parts of the world who don't even exist, so you have to bring them into being. But over the course of a few years, you can actually set up a whole new ecosystem of delivery mechanisms and services that we can use. So we do have very similar outcomes